Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a lecture on Arlie Russell Hochschild's book Strangers in Their Own Land. And it is a contemplation on the US political right and their narrative of nationhood. It's also a narrative of change, it's a narrative concerning globalization, and it is very much a narrative about identity. Now, Arlie Russell Hochschild is a celebrated sociologist at the University of California in Berkeley. She has written a series of really excellent studies, the core of which are studies on affect. And on emotions and the ways in which emotions play into everyday life. The way in which people have to put on a particular performance for work, like the book Managed Heart. And in this particular case, the way in which people feel about what is happening in their country. So the theme of this course is really about nationhood, the nation as an imagined community. And of course, while the conceit is that there is one nation, in actuality there are multiple interest groups vying to dominate and monopolize what the nation is and who's included and who's excluded from the nation. And often that particular battle over identity and belonging is one that can become extremely contentious. And in the United States, here we have a situation of extreme political polarization, the degree to which there is antipathy for people who are members or supporters of the other political party is very, very strong. And she talks about the ways in which that has grown over the last number of decades. So the kind of standard sociological questions that you would get about whether you are willing to have a member of your family marry a person from the other political party. The degree of tolerance of that, or intolerance towards that, has grown over the last number of decades in the United States. And of course, we are in a situation where we have a very divided political landscape and a presidency which has very low levels of legitimacy amongst the majority of the population and a very low public opinion approval rating. Now, her book came out in September of 2016, so it came out before the election of Donald Trump, but it is one of the books, perhaps the best book, that provides us with insight into the political right today and provides us with some insight into the factors which led a lot of people to support Donald Trump, even though he didn't get the majority of the popular vote. Of course, he got the votes in the right places and as a consequence won the Electoral College and became president. So what I wanted to do in assigning this book was to connect some of the larger themes in the course about identity and struggles over nationality, as well as struggles over resources, with themes concerning affect and, to a certain extent, themes concerning violence, or at least the conditions under which violence could occur because of the development of narratives of division and otherness within the nation. Now, Hochschild's book is one that was very deliberately marketed for a general audience. It's very skillfully written to have a broad appeal. And it is a book which was really extremely successful, and remains extremely successful. So you will have it. We need to note that it was one of the finalists in 2017 of the books from 2016 in the category non-fiction. And the particular books that make it into this list are really books that I would recommend you looking at. In fact, the whole book site, the National Book Foundation, is one that I would recommend you look at, so that you can get some sense as to some of the great books that are published every year in the US. And they're usually on audio too, and I don't know if any of you have encountered the audio version of this book, but it's excellent. So let me talk a little bit about kind of the larger context here. And that larger context is American politics, and a series of different studies by journalists and others on this deepening political polarization in the United States, really from 1984, from the Republican Revolution, the Gingrich-led revolution, in protest against or in reaction to the election of Bill Clinton as president after 12 years of Republican rule. Ronald Reagan twice, and then George Herbert Walker Bush before Bill Clinton got elected. And so that sort of backlash against Clinton led to the really the deepening of political polarization in the United States, and it's only got worse since. So some books that are part of this very important conversation. Well, Richard Hofstadter's classic book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, is one that is really worth considering. There's a longer arc to the degree to which you have in American politics certain charismatic populists who spin conspiracy theories and also are demagogues of one type and another. Of course, Joseph McCarthy is the sort of classic example of that, but then you have sort of cleverer politicians like Richard Nixon taking advantage of that, being very much part of that sort of Red Scare in the 1940s, and then taking advantage of that and writing it to the presidency. So a series of books that have come out in recent years. Anatole Lieven's book, America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism. I've used that in some of my classes. That talks about a thesis and an antithesis, this sort of clash in American nationalism, and provides a kind of portrait of the sources, the Jacksonian sources of American nationalism on the right, as well as the evangelical sources. George Packer's book, a writer for the New Yorker, who actually won the National Book Prize with his study, The Unwinding, an Inner History of the New America, which really is a ground level reporting from a series of different locations across the country, North Carolina, Florida, and elsewhere, and is an investigation of the collapse of the liberal social contract that developed from FDR onwards, that are sometimes called Fordism, which began to come apart in the 1970s, but really has frayed tremendously with globalization and the opening of the US economy to international forces like never before. Now, the election of George W. Bush and re-election of him stimulated Thomas Frank to write his very, very successful book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which subsequently became a documentary. And and he's a political journalist. He's still writing, and he's essentially asking, why did this sort of populist heartland state turn so sharply to the right? And then there are other more recent studies, the studies of the Tea Party movement by Theda Skocpol. There's another essay by Jill Lepore with the whites in their eyes. And then there's a very, very interesting DVD, which is actually cited by Arlie Hochschild, the documentary The Billionaires' Tea Party, on the Koch brothers and their funding of the Tea Party, which was the strong reaction, the backlash to the first black president of the United States, the first African-American president, Barack Obama. And then another study of the Koch brothers, Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money. And then you have a more recent study by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz on the Second Amendment, which is a sort of the theme of violence and militias and how that plays into the particular moment that we find ourselves in this kind of polarized condition. Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, We Were 8 Years in Power, and his previous memoir, very powerful memoir. He's a writer for The Atlantic, is also sort of essential reading on this as part of the these are sort of public intellectual journalists writing on this, and then there's academic literatures, and so we're examining one of these academics in looking at Hochschild's work. So her theme, as I mentioned, is emotion and politics. Well, in this book is about emotion and politics. Her theme more generally is about emotion and identity. And the method in the book is it's not quite an immersive ethnography where you would go and live with a particular group of people for like 1 or 2 years. It's more a traveling immersive ethnography. She does exploratory research. She has a sort of entree. She describes it in the book, an entree to various sets of peoples, and does using the snowball technique of interviews, and then following on with interviews of people who her interviewees recommend that she talks with. And then she does a series of participatory observation and in-depth follow-ups, visits. She calls them visits and follow-arounds. But she's really going to certain key events, going to demonstrations, going to party meetings, going to church, as well as doing in-depth series of interviews with key figures. And these kind of central figures emerge. And so it is sort of it's where George Packer's technique of journalism meets a very accessible academic technique. It's essentially a form of research which has rigor to it, but is building upon some of the practices of journalists. But I think it's a little more in-depth than some journalistic research. And her research question, her central research question is, what is the emotional draw of right-wing politics? What does it feel like? How does the state of the country feel to the right in the United States? And then she has a series of hypotheses going into this, and then she generates her theoretical categories, which sort of emerge. So it's an inductive form of theorizing based upon what she's encountering and trying to work through with a series of different sort of inspirational texts to guide her, which give her initial hypothesis. And then what she produces is a thick description, a portrait of the felt subjectivities of the people that she meets, encounters, and seeks to capture how the world feels to them, and how they manage change, and how they manage all of these setbacks and all of these paradoxes and contradictions. So that's the particular method that she's using. You will notice in the end of the book that there is an appendix. So she is interested in speaking to an academic audience and making sure that academics understand that there's actually a method, a clever worked out method in what she is doing. It's simply that she is tweaking it in a way that makes it accessible to a broad audience. Now, of course, she begins with her own subjectivity, and part of why the book works as a story is that there's a geographic contrast between her own situatedness in Berkeley, California, which of course has got its own sets of imaginaries, versus Lake Charles, which is where she does a lot of her research. And you can see where Lake Charles is here, down at the southwest of Louisiana. But she also does studies down here also. So that geographic contrast is important. So part of the method also is the self-situatedness. It's not necessarily confessing biases so much as it is confessing a certain situatedness and therefore being aware that you're taking that into the particular research environment. And that's good methodological practice. These particular, you're going in as a particular actor into this field. She's also going in as a woman. She's going in as white. And those things are important too. And it is worth kind of reflecting upon the fact that there's certain things that may not have been available to her if she wasn't older, and so on and so forth. There's a line in there in the book where she kind of essentially acknowledges that. Now, here's the tourist image of Louisiana. And of course, Louisiana in part is driven by tourism. New Orleans has a particular image associated with it, and there's a sort of a foodie quality to Louisiana. But the actual reality of Louisiana, and it's sort of this contrast between the imaginary and the real, is that it is an extremely poor, one of the poorest states in the United States, even though it's actually rich in resources. But it's that there's a lot of oil and gas, and there's a lot of infrastructure associated with that gas. But it is one that has been completely dominated by a corporate power and has had its state gutted by various Republican governors down the years. There's also been a lot of corruption. In the past, it was heartland for Huey Long, who was the kingfisher, a very populist political figure in the United States, a U.S. senator, ran for president, and then, of course, Bobby Jindal Jindal ran for president too later, but representing a very, very different type of politics and a very different vision of the state and what the state can do. So she begins with a series of hypotheses, and she sort of summarizes these as the great paradox. So she talks about Tom Frank's book and his argument that the reason why, and the paradox is really, why do poor people who need the government, need government services, need government protection from environmental pollution and the like, why did they vote against what is their manifest economic, social, and environmental interests? So there's a certain objective by any objective criteria, these are all things that are going to help them. Why do they vote against that? Why do they vote for politicians who are in favor of minimalist state, in favor of corporate control state, redistributing towards those already rich? Why do they vote for politicians that are hostile to the social programs that they need and use, and so on and so forth? And the way in which Frank answers this is that there's a sort of bait and switch, that these politicians give you cultural issues, and then they follow through with economic policies. So the kind of classic summary of that from his book is, you know, vote to stop abortion and receive a rollback in capital gains taxes. Vote to get government off your back and receive conglomeration and monopoly everywhere. So, but there is another version of that which she cites, Alec McGillis's thesis, which is actually a New York Times essay, Who Turned My Blue State Red. You can read it online, and it is one that makes a different argument from Frank, and he argues that those who sort of use government services generally tend to not vote, whereas those that don't use government services tend to vote. So he sort of focuses on participation rates in the electoral system, the elections themselves. Now, she actually thinks both of these accounts are inadequate. She cites another book, Colin Woodward's book, which deals with the sort of cultural, geographic divides within the United States, the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. And so she wants to bring geography into consideration. She thinks that that's an important explanation, but it's geography as in a sort of cultural geography of regions which have been created by structural forces, how these particular areas were integrated into the world economy, and their historic, the legacies of that to this contemporary moment. And so what she wants, she puts it, the great paradox for her is, how can a system both create pain and also deflect blame from that pain? So there's a blame attribution concern in her work that is central. And then she writes at one point, how does it work to be misled? So that in and of itself is the sort of the great paradox, and she wants to sort of go deeper into this than existing studies. So here are some of the key concepts that she develops, and these sort of grow out of her previous work, like The Managed Heart and the Second Shift. So first of all, feeling rules. And these are really the structures of normative feeling, the shoulds and should nots of feeling. And then she gives us this concept, which I think is a very, very useful one, of the deep story. And it is a narrative as felt. It's a story that feels as if it were true. So this is an important point. This is not a true story. This is a truthy story. This is a particular narrative that is dominant, that is hegemonic within a particular socio-demographic group. It is how they understand and arrange the world, and it is also an inaccurate understanding of how the world actually works. So it is one that it misserves those that hold this particular narrative. But why they hold it and why they continue to hold it in the face of contrary evidence or in the face of setbacks, and how that actually feels is part of what she seeks to do. And And so she argues that she's building an empathy bridge to this deep story, to try to get at this deep story and to understand it. Central to this deep story is structural amnesia. It's a sort of classic concept from anthropology, from the classic era of anthropology. Evans Pritchard uses this concept, and it is essentially a name for selective memory. It's the things that are systematically forgotten, systematically marginalized, systematically left to one side, or made invisible. They don't stick. And it's that sort of recounting of the past and what happened in the past and how that works is how we need to understand this, how this narrative is constructed. It's the deep story is one which is based upon a particular form of memory and a particular form of privileging of a certain way of telling, and also who gets to tell the story, because in many instances this is gendered and racialized. Now, there's also an agenda-setting aspect to this structural amnesia. She talks at one point about the topic doesn't come up, which is the sort of classic kind of theme in media studies and in political science too. But it is part of how we need to understand how this deep story actually works. And then she talks about structural power and feeling management, and these are sort of themes from her her prior work, and how the ways in which particular needs of certain groups and what particular timescales get priority. So it's the timescales of corporations as opposed to the timescales of environmentalists. It is being concerned about economic growth, about jobs, as opposed to being concerned about the fact that your property is going to be washed away, which is happening in parts of Louisiana because of rising tides and climate change. And then there's a concern with blame attribution and about subjectivities and the making of particular types of subjectivities. Now, think of this sort of in an Althusserian sense. These are sort of imaginary, idealized identities that people think that they aspire to, that they think that they have, that they live out, being religious, being churched, and the like. And then what goes along with that is the sort of well-established grooves of blame attribution. There's always certain types of people or certain groups that are blamed. And of course, one of the central ones here is the government. Which is never really the politicians you elect. It is the state. Even though there's sort of lots of paradoxes and contradictions in that. So then she provides us with an analysis of the social terrain, or the social field, as Bourdieu would say. So there's it's really an ecology here that she's providing us with an analysis of, which is a particular fetishization of certain objects, guns. It's not that central a theme, but I have also assigned a review essay by her husband, who is also a very well-known historian at Berkeley, Adam Hochschild, who wrote an amazing book on the Congo, but a more recent book on guns and gun culture in the United States. But it is, nevertheless, it's part of the social terrain of the American right, which he's looking at. And then there's the churches, the mega churches, and the particular vision of sort of prosperity gospel that is being promoted in these mega churches. There's, of course, the media ecology, Fox News, Breitbart now online and elsewhere. And there's the Tea Party movement and its particular articulation of certain themes. And then it became Trump-Pence. So sort of Trump-Pence is able to go into this particular ecology and capture it, and then use it to vault to the presidency. So the deep story and the people in it. So the waiting in line metaphor is one that is really quite central to this deep story. It is the idea that there's an American dream and people are in line for the American dream. Now, implicitly there is a virtuous hierarchy, and it's a racialized hierarchy at work here. This idea of cutting in line as someone jumping ahead of you is something that is central to the waiting in line story. So it's not simply a metaphor of waiting in line. That's what should happen. That's what we're doing. We, the virtuous people, are waiting for the American dream. But then that is being undermined by people who are who are getting special treatment. And inevitably this is immigrants, this is African Americans. This is a class of people who do not look like us, who do not have the same virtues, the same particular religion, and so on and so forth. So these line cutters are those that are the source of social opprobrium and hatred. This is a particular story which is virtuous in its telling amongst the people who hold it, but of course from an outside perspective, from people who are not of that tribe, of that particular community, this is clearly a story which is shot through with all sorts of notions of racial hierarchy and virtue, religious virtue. It's a sort of ethno-nationalist, racialized story. So that is part of the value of her book is in providing us with insight into this story and how it works. So it's a deep story which configures race, gender, class, and government in certain ways, but it's often implicit, it's often unspoken. It sort of goes without saying because it comes without question. So that is something that I think is kind of valuable about her work. Now, what's also valuable is the way in which people have to deal with massive contradictions and eruptions in their world. And the Bayou Corne sinkhole, which is pictured here, and you can read about it in the, you go to Wikipedia and you can read about this, is one of a series of different eruptions, things that happen which sort of contradict the values that you hold, and they present you with something which is extremely unpleasant and something which causes you pain. But then how do you manage and deal with that pain, and how do you make sense of it? And so part of the value of the book is this sort of account of sense-making on the part of the people who have to live in a deeply polluted place, and that some of the things that they hold central to their identity, living on the bayou, eating, fishing and eating the fish that they catch, is so contaminated and so destroyed by the particular politicians and power structure that they affirm in their electoral behaviour. So that is part of the sort of managing of these contradictions that she looks at. And she looks at it by really giving us a portrait of different subjectivities. The stoic cowboy, the team player, the worshipper, and then the rebel who's a team loyalist with a new cause. So this is the case really of Mike Schaff. And it's a very, very powerful account. Now, the end of the book, she sort of pulls back a little bit and addresses the important issue of race. And she cites Cash's book as well as Van Woodward's book on Southern identity and the civil rights movement in the sort of the 1860s and the 1960s. And this is also something that Coates cites too. It's this poor white sharecropper mentality. That particular person who saw himself as a potential planter, who was not a slave, who was not a Negro. They were marginalized by the plantation system, but they took the values of that, particularly buying into the idea that they were not at the bottom. And Coates is really kind of very sharp in this. In his essay, he cites a servant lady who reacts very strongly when someone asks about her master, because she's white. And so we're not slaves, we're not like them. So though these particular communities may be far back in line from the American dream, they're not as far back as blacks, as those that are enslaved. And it's keeping that and ensuring that that hierarchy remains that is really something that is part of this deep story. There's also a sense of besieged self. So the deep story is attached to notions of honor, but the women's movement, racial equality, globalization, secular education, the fact that there are now Syrian refugees who are Islamic, and Muslims, all of these are seen as squeezing the honor of the deep self, so that the person who believed themselves to be central to their imaginary nation, sort of white masculine figures, suddenly see themselves as victims, that they are being victimized by all of these elites who are calling into question their particular identity. And so the reaction is fierce, and the reaction is to double down on that particular identity. The reaction is often a violent one. It's about the sort of Second Amendment absolutism. And it's racialized, it's Islamophobic, and of course it's now about dividing the world into globalists versus the nationalists. Only they wouldn't say nationalists necessarily, would be versus America first people. And so you have Donald Trump, a billionaire from New York, a real estate billionaire who is someone who has a global empire and has sought to make his brand global, but emerged as a very effective confidence man in the presidential system, perhaps the greatest con man in US history. because he was so good at selling himself, selling this vision of prosperity, of restoration. He was the emotions candidate, the candidate who made those who felt strangers in their own land no longer feel that way. But of course, in so doing, he has left the left feeling like strangers in their land too. And so she talks about that page 235, 236. The liberal deep story. An alarming event occurs. Marauders invade the public space, recklessly dismantle it, and selfishly steal away bricks and concrete chunks from the public buildings at its center. Seeing insult added to injury, those guarding the public square watch helplessly as those who dismantled it construct private McMansions with the same bricks and pieces of concrete, privatizing the public realm. So this idea that the White House is no longer public, and the White House is moved to Florida, the ways in which the emoluments clause has been neglected, marginalized with Trump, the sort of privatization, the utilization of the public office of the presidency for private gain, corporate private gain, is one that is causing great anger on the part of the American left. So that's part of the story, a story that in part may be one that needs to be told by a new book in the next number of years, which is the left's deep story. So what are some of the weaknesses of this book? Well, this book is not about Trump per se. It's about what the emotional environment or emotional ecology and political ecology that he was able to take advantage of and turn to his own needs. It doesn't capture the alt-right and it doesn't contemplate the whole theme of violence that much, which is why I have assigned her husband's piece, because that's an important aspect of the contemporary moment too, and it is one that is manifesting itself in movements like Black Lives Matter, as well as the recent demonstrations by students, March for Our Lives. It also arguably does not sufficiently give credence to the story of race. So the fact that she is a older white woman perhaps comes with particular ways of seeing, and I think Ta-Nehisi Coates would make this argument, that is blind to the deeply racialized nature of the current moment and the deeply racialized nature of the divide in the United States. Overall, I hope that you enjoy the book. I think the book is really a very, very, very accessible one, which has got a lot of sophistication in its conceptual categories, as well as a lot of empathy for its subjects. I will assign a series of different videos where she is presenting the book so you can see her in person discuss it. Okay? I am going to leave it there. Thank you.